According to a Pew Research study, as of 2017, 58% of Americans say racism is a big problem in our society. However, how is this historical issue still occurring, and how is it affecting our youth? To look at this, we'll have to examine back in time to 1619 when the first slaves arrived by the Middle Passage, which was a grueling way slaves were shipped to the New World. America was in need for labor to run their plantations since the population was still scarce. Additionally, with the invention of the cotton gin in 1794, the demand for slaves grew, as did the profit on cotton. By 1820, the country had divided into the North and the South by the Mason-Dixon line. This line laid the mark between the free and the slave states. The Northerners were mostly against slavery due to moral reasons, and they also had no use for slaves, as most agriculture in the North were self-sufficient family farms. Because of this, many northern states had voted to end slavery. However, in the South, the need for slaves grew as it became apparent that the African Americans were more resistant to diseases and the toll that manual labor took on one's body than the whites. Therefore, slavery was known as a necessary evil. In 1831, Nat Turner led a slave rebellion with the goal of killing slave masters in order to free the slaves. Many whites and even more blacks died in this attempt, and the rebellion was a failure. Life became much harder and gruesome for the slaves in the South. However, abolitionists came to light in response to the growing mistreatment of slaves. All abolitionists had varying reasons on why they thought slavery should be abolished, whether they were secular or religious. However, John Brown took on a very aggressive form. He led violent attacks against pro-slavery people, and in 1859 he raided Harper's Ferry. He spread terror throughout the South, which later influenced the succession of the Confederacy. A year after the start of the Civil War, Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, stating that all slaves in the states that rebelled would be freed by 1863. In 1865, the Civil War finally ended, with the North taking the victory. Furthermore, the 13th Amendment was passed that freed all slaves. However, between 1865 and 1866, even though African Americans were freedmen, black codes arose in the South. These were a system of laws placed on former slaves as an attempt to recreate slavery and form social control. Further progress continued in 1868 with the passage of the 14th Amendment, which made freedmen citizens. Additionally, the 15th Amendment was passed in 1870, which banned voting restrictions based on race. Although former slaves appeared equal on paper, in 1896 it was ruled that segregation was legal. The Jim Crow system ruled the South, which resembled pre-14th Amendment times. Along with the separation, states also began working to make it difficult for blacks to vote by the use of literacy tests, taxes, and more. The civil rights movement began in the 1950s. In 1954, the case Brown versus the Board of Education ruled that segregation was not allowed in schools. This was a major breakthrough, as black children could now receive some education. In 1955, Rosa Parks began the Montgomery bus boycott, which decreased revenues for the bus system and also showed the world how persistent African Americans were when it came to their rights. Another event at the grassroots level occurred in 1960 at the Greensboro sit-in, which was a nonviolent protest by African American college students. In 1963, a march on Washington led by Martin Luther King Jr. and many influential advocates occurred. This gained national attention. Shortly after, President Johnson signed the Civil Rights Bill, which eliminated the Jim Crow system, and the Voting Rights Act, which restricted policies that limited blacks in voting, both of which were part of his greater plan of reform called the Great Society. So after all this reform, how is it possible that racism is still a 21st century issue? Dr. Heron states that race runs deep in our history and culture, and in certain ways it's the core of our political culture, which makes it hard to eliminate. As a growing country, it was instilled in the social and political agenda this form of hierarchy between races for centuries. As times are changing, some people have also changed. However, some people still hold true to these historical values of our ancestors, which cause many issues in our society today. It can be seen that legal restrictions and views are much quicker to change rather than societal views and opinions. We have seen these issues in increased hate crimes, rallies, and other movements in the media, but to think even closer to home, racism is taking a toll on our youth, and this should be addressed. In the 1940s, Dr. Kenneth and Dr. Cole conducted the doll test, which tested African American children's racial perceptions. These doctors found that most of the children favored the white doll.